So how's the balance in your social currency account these days? Did your last post on Facebook get as many likes as you were hoping for? Is your follower count up to the number that makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside? Or if you are unconcerned or unburdened with a social media following, have you had an experience recently when you did something particularly impressive, and more importantly, there were a lot of people around to notice when you did it? Or did you do something kind of humiliating and wish there was nobody around to see it, but then you did that furtive little check and unfortunately somebody saw you? We get triggered by those kinds of recognitions, and some of them are just as powerful or as poignant as at Jesus' time, and others like Facebook accounts and Instagram followers and Twitter followers are new waves of social currency and prestige that could never have been imagined in the time of Christ. And yet the underlying principle of seeking recognition and being affirmed by recognition, or being anxious or despairing at the lack of having social capital, is as timeless as ever. And so Jesus gets invited to a dinner at someone else's home, but he does not play by the rules. And not only is he not jockeying for position the way that he sees other people doing around him, but he goes one step further and he critiques this social competition that he sees going on two levels. Not only critiques it on the level of the guests, all checking each other out to see who's going to get the places of honor and who's going to get the short end of the table. I don't know if you've ever done that, and you get there and there's a new table and you go, oh, I'm going to pick my favorite seat, or you get there last and you're stuck on the end or wherever and you go, darn it. He not only critiques that dynamic that is going on, but then in the second part of what we've heard, he critiques his host. And I'm thinking, he's not ever going to get invited back to that guy's house. But there's these two levels of critique, and the way that he talks about how to navigate that social landscape raises a question. He gives advice about how not to go for the highest place in the beginning, because then, you might be shamed and you might be told, you're not as uppity as you think you are. Go down, not just a notch or two, but go all the way down to the kids' table and suffer the shame of being the very last one. But then he gives this advice. He says, sit in the lowly place so that then the host might come to you and say, friend, move higher. And for a second, if we think about it, it might sound like he's playing the same game, but he's just advising his hearers to be more cagey about it. Right? It could sound like the advice is, practice false humility. Oh, no, I'm not worthy of that seat up there. I'm going to go down here. You see me? I'm down here. This isn't where I belong. Come get me. And be that, except for the very end of the teaching in both sections. Both to the guests and to the host, there is this theological commentary in language that some of us are familiar with, but puts a different spin on the dynamic that's going on. In the end of the first section, he gives the advice that he gives, and he says, because those who are exalted will be, those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted. And we're used to hearing this kind of juxtaposition of language. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. This is a familiar turning of the dynamic in the Gospels. But the specific meaning that's being conveyed in that word humbled takes two turns. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and the sense of that being humbled is to be shamed, is to be embarrassed, is to be put in a place losing social capital in front of others. But when the phrase turns and it says those who humble themselves will be exalted, it's not those who shame themselves or embarrass themselves will be exalted. The turn of the meaning is those who make a habit of carrying themselves among others with a self-worth that is not dependent upon external recognition. Those who carry themselves among others with a spirit of humility that is rooted in their self-worth as beloved of God, not as one who has 30,000 Instagram followers. And it's an important distinction. It's not about embarrassment in front of the other, it's about self-worth in the eyes of the one who has given all life. Those who humble themselves, those who make a point of caring more about their relationship in the eyes of God than their standing in the eyes of others, will be exalted. And we know that to be true about the way of God's kingdom. We know that from other instances of Jesus's going and spending time with those who were outcast, with those who were socially shunned, placing himself in a situation that if you were playing the social ladder climbing game would be to lose standing. And he is in fact criticized sometimes for doing that. His disciples get asked, "Why does your Lord eat with tax collectors and sinners? That's not what VIPs do." But he's playing a different game. He's operating in a different context of relationship. And so those who humble themselves will be lifted up in the eyes of God, in whose standing is the only one that really matters. So it would be enough if you were invited to a social function at somebody else's house and your approach to going and being that person's guest was to start criticizing the other guests. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He goes on and has some critique for the host as well. I'm just checking out the guest list here, and this looks like some pretty prominent people in the community. What election campaign are you going to be up for that you're going to want to call in these favors? What's the motive behind the invitation to this dinner? And the way he turns the tables in the advice to the host is invite the poor and the crippled and the lame. And those are not accidental categories. We may recognize them as, in general, those who would be of low social standing, perhaps, but not necessarily lower means than others. But those categories were also characteristic of stations in life that would exclude you from most occupations, from the ability to function and contribute and perform in society in ways that would earn the recognition and the respect of others. They would make you, in the worst sense of the word, charity cases. And Jesus is saying that's who should be on the guest list. Because then there's no possibility of ulterior motive of I'm doing this for you, but we understand that there's something coming back my way later on down the road. And the connection that he makes there, again at the end of this section, is that if you're not repaid by some kind of mutual favor, if you didn't invite people to the birthday party so they'd give you lots of good gifts, then what you are building up in your account is not your social currency, but your heavenly currency. You're building up not the esteem of others, which as quickly as it arises can the next day be taken away, but instead something lasting and eternal in the sight of God, who blesses each and every one of us in order to be a blessing to others. So I don't know whether Jesus ever got invited back to that host's house again for dinner. But whether or not his critique was appreciated, he was doing everybody there on that occasion a favor. And whether they knew it or not, what all who trade in social currency for their own self-esteem come to realize at one point or another is that just as quickly as you got it, you can lose it. Those who are the hottest follows on YouTube and have the most relevant and current and cutting-edge content in their Twitter streams are tomorrow replaced by the next most cutting-edge and current person, who in turn is going to be replaced by the next one. And when those subscriber counts go down, and when those followers start disappearing, and when those likes start diminishing, it hurts. In the same way that someone might gossip about you behind your back, or that the humiliation might be felt when you trip over your feet and land face first on the sidewalk in the midst of a crowd, it hurts. But the favor that Jesus was doing to his guests was saying, you don't have to play that game. Your well-being, your esteem is much more secure when it is rooted in relationship with God. For being in a place of humility, in a constant attitude of not needing to call attention to one another, acting in keeping with the character of God, is something that can never be taken away. Is something that will not ever be replaced by the next hottest trend. Is something of eternal value. It is not a social currency account, but it is a heavenly account that simply appreciates perpetually in the eyes of God. And the great thing about this economy, when we are building our heavenly currency, not in order to gain great recognition from others, but in order simply to mold our own characters in the likeness of Christ, the great thing about God's economy is the supply of the currency is infinite. One person gaining more does not diminish the next person. And you can't outgive the giver. We don't ever have to suffer insecurity about what if our popularity shrinks, or what if we get too old and other people no longer see us as useful and productive and push us to the side. That dynamic does not happen in the eyes of God. There is never a time in which our belovedness in God's sight is undermined. So Jesus was doing those who were there that day a favor. And however many of them took that to heart, we can't know. But we are in the same position of being hearers of this wisdom of not how to play a game more savvy so that we might accumulate more to ourselves, but instead how to live a life most deeply so that our currency in relationship with the creator of all of the cosmos and the sustainer of our very beings is sound and abundant. That is a richness that is truly worth striving for. It is a richness that was modeled by the life of Christ. And it is a richness that is not dependent on a good economic cycle or a strong labor market or a popularity in the eyes of a particular community. It is a richness that is eternally present, available to us as those invited, drawn into the unconditional love of God. May it be a richness that we make our aim and our energy to strive for, and that we then in turn model for others, that as many as are willing and desiring can be drawn into the love of the kingdom of God, where all are beloved beyond imagination. Amen.